It's that time of the week, Pod Applaud Time, the weekly show that exists to enable your podcast habit. I'm your host, Seb, and I'm here to rant, rave, and applaud for all those sweet, sweet pods. This week, I have a couple podcast news bits. I'm going to offer up 4 podcast recommendations, and after that, I'm going to close out the show by talking a bit about the perfectly bingeable podcast, Last Scene. So, getting right into the news, Facebook launched its first North American podcast this week. They called it 3.5 Degrees, which seems super uninspired. Previously, the company tried an equally poorly named podcast in Australia called Face to Face. Bring back MySpace while we're at it, so we can have space to space. Even that might just be better. Somehow, in even weirder, yet more uplifting news, UK-based funny man Mark Watson is putting on a 26.2-hour live show. In an effort to promote his upcoming podcast, Mark Watson's Comedy Marathon, and raise money for Dementia Revolution, Mark decided it would be a great idea to put on a 26.2-hour live show in London. 26.2 hours? That's like watching all 3 Lord of the Rings Extended Edition movies twice, and then watching Titanic to top it off. Makes me think that maybe, just maybe, when Mark heard comedy was all about timing, he didn't quite hear the ing part. Anyways, that's all I wanted to talk about in podcast news this week. Now, I would like to talk about a few recommendations. For my first recommendation, I want to talk about Mania. No, not WrestleMania. No, not Beatles Mania or Sonic Mania. Just plain Mania. It's my goal on Pod Applaud to shout out new shows on the come up. To be more of a trailblazer, not just another source recommending shows already well liked and well reviewed by many. Mania is just such a show. Currently, Mania has 4 episodes out and each has improved on the last so much. The most current episode sealed the deal that I was not going to wait any longer to talk about Mania. So what is it, you ask? Well, the writer and creator of this podcast goes by Harlequin Grimm, whose specialty is writing horror and dark fantasy. Each episode, there is an aspect of flawed human history. Perhaps it is a story during the time which we thought reanimating the dead was possible. Or that people figured banshee whales were a real, tangible omen that foretold your demise. In these muddled historic times, the stories focus in on real documented events or actual historic figures. The real details of our patchwork history are modeled and incomplete. In these imperfections is where Mania takes the reins. Mania will take what we once believed of banshees and mix it into details of what we actually know of Scotland's King James. The result is a tale that is more gripping and eerie than pure truth or complete fantasy. I really like that at the end of the podcast, there's a short talk that reveals exactly what was real and what was fiction, which is helpful since sometimes it is not as obvious as actual real-life banshees. There is also talk about the ideas going on in the story, and what about our history compelled the tale into existence. Over just 4 episodes, this podcast has found its voice, has figured out how to weave atmospheric piano in very nicely, and prove that it can establish a mood of its own. I would say that the first episode may have been a little heavy-handed when it came to imagery, but now the cast has found comfort in subtlety, and it definitely shows. Check out Mania if you want to hear an eerie tale told well. And as a bonus, you get to think a bit about why we end up telling these odd tales. All right, I don't want to sound like I sleep in a coffin and practice dark magic, but I'm going to talk about another show with spooky themes. Well, it's really not that spooky though. Dark and Twisty Tales is a podcast that tells fables and tall tales from long ago. Old Brother Grimm tales, myth from folklore the world over. Nothing is off limits. I think a lot of people are aware that Disney has retold a lot of older, more sinister stories with a whimsical, fun, family friendly spin. The number of variations of Cinderella over the course of time alone is mind boggling. Cenerentola, Cendrillon, Aschenputtel, Aschenbrodel, Solushka, Cinderella, of course, and so many more. Julia Norton professionally narrates the older and odd versions of these stories on Dark and Twisty Tales. Also, sometimes these old tales have bits of song woven into them. They are also sang out, which adds to the telling of these dated fables. Julia has been a voice actor for over 20 years, so it is a treat to hear her at work in this podcast. So much of these old stories is obvious allegory, metaphor, or tales of warning for children. Some of them may be a bit out of touch with how society functions in modern times, but it is interesting to hear how storytelling was approached in days long ago. This cast makes me think of Dwight Schrute coming into the office dressed as Belschnickel, a Santa Claus-esque figure from Germanic folklore, saying, "Judgment is nigh, for Belschnickel ist I," in weirding out the rest of the office with his kooky traditions. Maybe I just like weird things. If you like weird things too, check it out. See how stories used to be told when the world was a bit weirder. This next show might be one of the most captivating science podcasts I've yet to hear. Maybe it is because it focuses not just on different scientific fields, but also the people who study those fields. Ologies is a podcast that tracks down people who study entomology, cosmology, primatology, somnology, epidemiology, and any other thing you can think of that may end in the word ology. Ali Ward tracks down an expert in each episode to tell us how their field relates to the world and what it means to dedicate themselves to their passion. Ali does, in fact, find someone deeply engrossed in their passion every episode, which is part of the charm of the cast. The guest's knowledge and eagerness to talk about their work is a lot of fun. Ali's interviews lend themselves to be very fun. She asks a lot of great questions that are more focused on the life of a volcanologist, for example, as opposed to just learning about the study itself. How the science influences the lifestyle of the person, what it takes to get into the field, and how the study changes who you may yet be. Another great aspect of the podcast is that sprinkled throughout the podcast, Ali will have post-interview recorded asides with her audience. These asides are all candid and make you feel like Ali is a close confidant. For example, in her first episode, she admits she laughed at her guest joke despite not getting it at all. She will also pop in to an aside to confirm or correct something that may have come up in an interview, or expand on an idea that may have been particularly interesting. So, to sum it up, the blend of intriguing guests, Ali's apt conversational talents, and all around candidness of this cast really makes it shine. If you want people following their passions, niche scientific trivia facts, good conversation, laughs, and a sense of discovery in your podcast, check out Ologies. One of my favorite aspects of podcasting is that Although formats and cliches are getting more and more established, sometimes a show comes along and breaks all the rules. There is still that Wild West feel when it comes to these special shows. Dr. Game Show is a prime example of Wild West podcasting. Hosted by Joe Firestone and Manolo Moreno, this podcast disregards most podcasting tropes. Although it does have a very tropey and catchy theme song. Ring, ring on the telephone, it's Joe. Joe Firestone, do you want to play a game? Tell her we're not home, but she needs to know she's Dr. Game Show Game. Anyway, after that song, you are plunged into a delightful chaos. Joe's goal on the show is to play games created and submitted by the fans of the show, with some of her comedian guests and fans who call into the show. Everyone else's goal on the show seems to be just doing whatever the hell they please. Some play the games cooperatively, while some just start spreading chaos and rejecting the premise of the show actively, trying to do anything but play the games. Manolo plays the role of the detached, uncaring judge, opposite to Joe's frustrated yet excited demeanor. The games are completely absurd ideas, such as Werewolf Elton John, in which you sing an Elton John song while slowly turning into a werewolf. Best performance wins, or state your unpopular opinion. In this game, players state something they believe society would heavily disagree with. The most controversial opinion wins. The show always ends up being completely off the rails. Check it out for a healthy dose of disorder. Now for the wrap up. My pick for bingers this week is a show that wrapped up in November of last year. And that show is Last Scene. This is a show that covers the infamous heist of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum on the 18th of March in 1990. Last Scene covers how an art collector green on the scene outbids a queen, had great masters convene, built a collection not lean, in a museum serene, until the obscene crime made the gallery unclean, slashed like Wolverine, canvas from frame and screen, taking what's in between, now the art is forever unseen, since that fateful March 18. This story is great. There's mob ties, high stakes, art bidding wars, acid trip parties, and multiple different tangents to go down. It is not a spoiler to say that this case has not been solved by any means. That much is covered in the first episode. For me, that only adds to the allure and thrill of the show. I really liked listening to a true crime podcast where the emphasis wasn't on a murderer or focusing on deadly tragedy and destruction of human life. As sad and culturally devastating as this crime has been, we can at least say that it has spawned a remarkable narrative. Check out this show if you like a good, open-ended mystery and want all the thrill of a crime show without the expense of human life. Okay, that is the show for the day. Thank you for tuning in and listening. If you enjoyed yourself, please subscribe on your podcast apps, review on iTunes, or tell your friends about this podcast. Those are the top ways to help me out. I really appreciate every listen, but I'm absolutely blown away when I get reviews or see someone sharing the show. By the seashore. Looking to submit a news article, an audio clip, or email praising one of your favorite podcasts, or share live show events? Send anything you'd like discussed on the show to podapplaud@gmail.com, or find me on Twitter at podapplaud.